We really have been just blasting through chapter 14. If you remember it wasn't more than like 2 weeks ago that we finished up chapter 13. It felt like we spent weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks in chapter 13 because we did. But now in 2 weeks, we've pretty much wrapped up chapter 14. If you remember from last week, we just finished the feeding of the 5,000. And it ended with Jesus going up onto the hill, going up onto this mountaintop. And he was to go to be with his Father, and he was going to pray. Now, the gospel according to John actually gives us a little bit more detail about this story of the feeding of the 5,000, in the sense that we actually learn that the crowds, he sent away the crowds after the miracle because the crowds tried to force Jesus. They tried to force Jesus to be king, to take him as this worldly king, the people that the Jewish people were looking for, this Messiah to come that was going to rule the nations. But we know that this was not the purpose for Jesus coming. We also know that this is not the time that Jesus was going to complete his earthly ministry here on earth. So what does Jesus do? He sends everybody off. And Jesus goes up onto the hillside, where we are told that he spends most of the night, if not all the night, in prayer. And again, the passages that we're going through today, these are really just such well-known passages in Scripture. I know that if you've been a Christian for a while, it is very likely, it's extremely likely, that you have heard this message before, or that you've done a Bible study before on this very passage that we're going through. And it may even be likely today that you're thinking to yourself, yep, I got it, I remember, I know the point of this story. Jesus is with us even in the storms of our life. Jesus is with us all the time, and the takeaway is that I'm supposed to keep my eyes on Jesus, even in the storm. Like, I got it. I've heard this one before, right? And that's right. Let's just be honest. That's right. That is absolutely pretty much, it's a straightforward story. That is the message of the story today. So my question to everybody who is here today is why? Why then don't we see Christians, for the most part, why don't we see ourselves living this way? Why, if we know this story so well, if we know the lessons of these verses so very well, why do we continue as brothers and sisters of Christ to get caught up in these storms of our lives and asking ourselves the common question, Jesus, where are you? Jesus, where are you? God, where are you in the middle of this storm of my life? Jesus, I can't see you right now. I can't see you in the midst of this storm, Jesus. I can't hear you in the midst of the winds and the waves, the turmoil that is currently going into my life right now. Why, God? Why do I feel like I'm drowning? We continually talk about having faith in the Christian life. But my question is, what does that actually mean? Like, what does having faith actually look like? And specifically, what does Christian faith actually look like in the midst of the storms that we go through in our lives? Two things that I want to ask is, what does it mean to know that Christ is with you in the storm? What does it mean to also have faith? To have faith that Christ is with you in the storm. And I believe that the verses that we're going through today, I feel that they address these two characteristics of our walk with Jesus just so very well. So very well. How can we know in the storm that Jesus is with us? How can we have faith that Jesus is with us in the storm of our life? They're actually two complementary aspects of our walk that we have with Jesus: knowledge and faith. Now, both of these characteristics, are found in Jesus. Knowledge and faith are both found in the person of Jesus Christ. And when we take our eyes off of Jesus in the middle of the storm, as Peter did, when we take our eyes off the person who embodies knowledge and who embodies faith, then we end up with nothing to sustain our belief. However, with that, there is hope. Even with that, there's hope. And just as our knowledge and as our faith is found in Jesus Christ, so also our hope. Our hope is found in the person of Jesus. And the story that we're going through today, I think it speaks to this so very well. So as we continue here in chapter 14, you can open up your Bibles. Matthew chapter 14, if you're already not there, you can follow along. And as we continue, we see that Jesus, he sent this very large crowd away. And he also compelled, or another word for it is he commanded. He commanded his disciples to get into a boat and to cross the Sea of Galilee in front of him, to cross the Sea of Galilee before Jesus did, to the other side. And then Jesus, he heads up onto this mountainside, he heads up onto this hilltop. And on the hilltop, Jesus, he's praying. He's praying all night, and Matthew tells us that the disciples who are in the boat, they haven't really made it that far across the lake yet, maybe like halfway across or so. Matthew says that they've only made it so far across, even through all the night, because they've been fighting. They've been fighting the strong wind that's come up. They've been fighting the winds. They've been fighting the waves that they've been trying to get across. And we talked about this right before, the Sea of Galilee. We talked about because of where it is located, because of like the topography around this massive lake and where it sits. When the winds pick up around this lake, the body of water gets extremely rough. It can get very, very rough. It could get as rough or even rougher than some of the roughest seas that you've been in. And the disciples, some of them fishermen, have undoubtedly seen stuff like this before. They've ran into stuff like this before. They themselves, they find themselves in this horribly terrifying situation, which is really, it's a life and death type of situation that they find themselves in right now. And when we look at this picture that's just kind of, it's being painted here with the disciples in the middle of this large body of water in the early hours of the morning, and they're trying to get somewhere, but they've just been fighting the wind, they've been fighting the waves all night. They've had little or no progress. The winds are picking up, the waves are getting larger. They're starting to lose faith. They're starting to lose faith that they're going to make it across this lake at all. It really seems like a pretty good picture of our lives at times, if you ask me. In the middle of the storms in our lives, we're in the middle of the fight, and we fight, and we start to question, or we start to lose, or we start to question our faith as we're like halfway across the process. We question our faith, we question our belief. And then in this story, though, we also see Jesus, right? We see Jesus, and he's up on this mountaintop, and he's praying, and he's looking upon his disciples, and Jesus is noticing. He's noticing that they're in distress, and they're noticing the trouble that they have found themselves in. This picture also, for me, I think it paints a good picture for our lives as well. I mean, this separation that we think that we see between us and Jesus Christ. The separation that we see between the disciples and Jesus right now. It's a physical separation, right? It's a physical separation that we actually really haven't seen this type of physical separation between the disciples and Jesus yet through our time reading through the book of Matthew. They've always been like right by Jesus' side. The disciples have always been right by his side up until this point. But Jesus, he commands them to go in front of him, to go ahead of him, to go without him, without his physical presence, and to cross this lake. And honestly, when I'm reading the story, the thought kind of comes across into my head, and I go, ha, you see? Now you disciples, you kind of get to see what it's like for me. Jesus isn't physically there with you anymore. He's up on some hillside, and you're trapped in these raging waters, in this big body of water, and Jesus ain't with you right now. He's not physically with you right now. He's not there to hold your hand anymore, is he? That's the way that I think about it when I first read these verses. But that's never been true at all, right? Not in my life, not in the disciples' life. For myself, for you, for the disciples, that type of thinking has just never been true. Anytime that I have ever felt separated from God, anytime that I felt like he's on some mountaintop and he's not right next to me, that's a false feeling, okay? Jesus isn't apart from us because he's physically on some mountaintop or because he's physically sitting at the right hand of God. Jesus is always with us. And I can have knowledge in that fact. I can have knowledge in that fact from what Scripture tells me. This is why Paul, he prays for the people in Ephesus, in Ephesians 1:17, when he says, I pray, Paul is speaking here, he says, I pray for you constantly, asking God, the glorious Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, to give you spiritual wisdom and insight so that you might grow in your knowledge of God, in your knowing of God, of who he is and where he is, and that he's with you at all times. Here's the thing, though. I have no doubt that in this story, the disciples right now, as the disciples are fighting for their lives, as they're fighting against the wind, as they're fighting against the waves, I have no doubt that each and every one of these disciples felt very much alone. That each one of them felt very much apart from Jesus while they're sitting in this boat. And it's not hard. It's not hard to feel that way when you're going through difficulties. If you're going through difficulties right now, whether it be like in your marriage, if you're going through difficulties right now because of the loss of somebody that you love dearly, going through financial difficulties, you're going through difficulties from this past year of like where COVID has put us, you're going through difficulties because you're just now getting back maybe into a church family for like a year because you haven't felt comfortable because of the social distancing or whatever it may be. Like whatever storm you're going through in your life right now. It's so easy for us to feel for the past year or for the past week or for the past however many days you've been going through that storm, it's so easy for us to feel like God is out of reach and he's on a hillside. But I think we need to ask ourselves a question. If you've ever felt that disconnect from God, or maybe you're actually feeling that disconnect from God right here, right now, I think we need to ask ourselves a question. In the story that we're reading through in Matthew chapter 14, in the story that we're reading through right now, do you think Jesus on that hillside ever really had his eyes off those disciples? Do you think that Jesus ever really wasn't paying attention to every single little detail that is happening to each and every one of those persons that are in that boat, to each and every detail that is happening to and around that boat? Because from what we have learned about Jesus so far, going through the gospel according to Matthew, not only is that incredibly, highly unlikely that Jesus doesn't know exactly what's going on in that boat right now, it's just downright impossible. It's downright impossible because we know the character and we know the nature of Christ. We know the character and we know the nature of God. We know that he is all-powerful. We know that he is all-knowing. We know that he is all-loving. And we know that he is just. We also know that Jesus has authority. Jesus has authority over all. We learned about this not more than a few chapters ago. We have the knowledge. We have the knowledge that all that is true. And guess what? The disciples had that knowledge as well. In fact, the disciples, they had that first-hand knowledge as well. But in the middle of the storm, I feel that we misplace that knowledge that we have in Christ. We forget in our fear something that we know very, very well, which kind of begs to ask the question again, why? Why do we continually find ourselves, like the disciples, in the middle of a storm, fearing something that we know that Jesus has authority over? Fearing something that we know that Jesus has authority over. Kind of a little bit of a side note here. Just for a second, I want you to logically just kind of think through this. Think through what is happening with the disciples right now. Jesus has commanded them. He told them specifically. He said, get in the boat, cross crossed the sea, and Jesus said what? He said, I will meet you. I am going to meet you on the other side. Specifically told the disciples that. Now, if you're a disciple and you not only know, but you've seen Jesus have authority over like everything. And Jesus tells you to get into the boat and he's going to go meet you on the other side. Then when the storm hits, then your attitude should be like, bring it. Bring it. That should be your attitude. Jesus told me that I'm going to get in this boat and I'm going to go on the other side. And Jesus told me that he's going to be there waiting for me when I get there. So you know what? Bring it. Is that all you got? But of course, that's not what we see. That's not what we see at all. It's not what we see in our lives. It's not what we see in the disciples' lives in the middle of the storm. And it's not what we see, again, in our lives most of the time, I would say, most of the time. So I want to ask the question, why? Like, what distracts us? What is the thing that distracts us from the knowledge that we have that Jesus is with us? I think that we get a little bit of a glimpse of what that answer is here as we read through verses 24 and 25. Matthew says, meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble, far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. In verse 25, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on water. And now what I want to focus on here for just a minute is I want to focus here on the time. I want to focus on the time. How long have they been out in the sea, in the middle of this, in the Sea of Galilee? How long have they been fighting the wind? Because Jesus, he sent them in the evening, right? Like, he sent them out in the evening, and Matthew says that Jesus, he went up on the hillside and that he prayed all night. And now it's 3 o'clock in the morning, that rolls around, and here comes Jesus. So the disciples, they've been in this storm. They've been fighting this storm all night and for most of the morning. Other translations, they actually say during the fourth watch of the night instead of 3 o'clock in the morning. And personally, I kind of like the translation, the fourth night or the fourth watch of the morning, because it just sounds like more nautical to me or something like that, I think. But the point here being that it's really early in the morning, okay? The point being it's really in the morning. Disciples, they've been fighting the wind, they've been fighting the waves, they've been doing this all morning. They are tired. They are exhausted. They're likely at the end of their physical and their emotional and their mental rope, and they're literally fearing for their lives right now. Out of the exhaustion of going through the storm for hours upon hours. And unless you're a sailor, which I am not at all, I don't think that you can fully understand or fully grasp what the disciples are going through. I just want to share this really quick. Emily's going to think that I'm crazy. She already does. It's okay. But I'm going to share this with you. Recently, it was like probably 3 or 4 months ago, I got into this, maybe it was like a midlife crisis. I was like, we're going to get a boat. We're gonna get a sailboat, and I started looking at like sailboats. I don't know how to sail. I've never sailed in my life. I was like, I would love to get a sailboat. We could go out onto the river. It'll be fun. Started watching these like YouTube things, right? Where this guy, for the first time, he buys a sailboat and he's teaching himself, and he's having other people teach him as well. But he's just going from a novice to, and he's vlogging like his journey, right? Well, he takes this guy watched like 4 or 5, 6 of his videos, and he's taking this first trip by himself on this like 32-foot sailboat that he bought. And he's kind of knows what he's doing, but he's not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. He goes from Florida to the Bahamas, and it's a big stretch. And not only is it a big, dangerous stretch, but apparently there's like this, there's the, what is it called when the water goes through the current, right? See, can't be a sailor. I don't even know what that's called. There's this really strong current that goes through, and the waves and the wind and the water can be just like kind of what's being described here. This guy is vlogging, and he starts out in the day, and then it goes to the night, and it just goes to this shot of him and the boat just getting tossed around. And he is fighting for his life. He is up all night because he's the only person on this boat. He's trying to save his sails from being torn apart. He's trying to save his boat from being flipped over and drowning him. He's all by himself. The next morning, he continues the vlog, and he is broken. He is exhausted. He's a Navy man, retired Navy man. He is crying. He feels like he just cheated death. And he's vlogging this in the background for him. Clear seas, beautiful sunny skies. Boat is just kind of making its way across. But what he just came through was life-changing for him. Life-changing for him. The point being that the fourth watch of the night, or that early morning, right before things get better, right before the sun came up and it got better for this guy and he found out, I'm going to live. Right before that, Jesus in this story, Jesus decides that he's going to calm the storm. When we are done, when we are exhausted, when we have tried everything, when we've tried everything humanly possible that we can think of to make it through the storm on our own. And I think here is where we see these complementary aspects of our walk with Jesus that kick in, that walk of knowledge and that walk of faith. I think we see the faith usually faith kicks in here. When we are so exhausted from the storm that our knowledge begins to fail us. Our knowledge begins to fail us. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus comes. He comes to check our faith. You've been struggling all night long, and you're spent. You're at the end of yourself. That's when Jesus, when he makes his entrance into this story. And I don't know if that's how it's been for you in the past, but I mean, speaking for myself, I can tell you this. During some of the most difficult storms that I've gone through, that I've faced in my life, difficulties in my marriage, difficulties in our finances, difficulties in my career, when I have tried and I have tried and I have fought and I have exhausted myself, I find that Jesus, he shows up. He shows up, and he shows up big. And he shows up big right before that tipping point. Right before the sun is going to come up. Right during that fourth watch of that night, Jesus shows up. And here's the thing. I truly do believe that there are times in our lives where we as Christians, professing Christians, I believe that there are times in our lives where God allows us to go through these storms in our lives. The sovereignty of God having ultimate authority over everything. God's sovereignty, it allows us to go through these storms in our lives for a period of time where we experience this trial. We experience trial, and it's for us to learn and to have a greater depth of knowledge and to have a greater depth of faith in who God is and what part we, as children of God, play in his kingdom. I truly think that there's many times when we are going through storms in our life that God, he's just waiting. He's waiting for that fourth watch of the night. He's waiting for us to get to the end of something. More often than not, God is waiting for us to get to the end of ourselves, is what he's waiting on. God is waiting for us to get to the end of our self-will, of our self-reliance, of our self-importance. He's waiting for us to acknowledge the fact that we truly do know and we truly do have faith that he is there always with us, always. So then we read that Jesus, he comes to the disciples. And of course, the disciples, they're physically, mentally, emotionally, they're just exhausted, right? But when Jesus arrives, What do they think is happening? If we go to verse 25 and 26, what do the disciples think is actually happening? It says, Jesus came towards them, and he's walking on the water. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost." And much like you and I in our exhaustion, they didn't recognize Jesus when we're exhausted. You can't blame them for this. They didn't recognize Jesus because they were in the middle of their fear. So they did what? They cried out in fear. In the middle of fear, and they cried out for fear because fear, I tell you what, fear, if you hold on to it, if you're in the middle of fear and you just hold on to fear, it's a downward spiral. Fear fosters fear, which fosters and invokes more fear. It's like a never-ending downward spiral. But then what do we see that Jesus do? He pulls the disciples out of their death spiral of fear by simply saying what? He simply says, verse 27, "Don't be afraid. Fear not, for I am here." The literal translation here, unfortunately, I think it gets a little bit lost in today's society. But when Jesus says, "Fear not," he literally says afterwards, "Fear not, I am. I am. I am," is what Jesus says. And for the disciples, this is a beautiful, it's a declaration. It's a declaration of Jesus that he is Yahweh, that Jesus is the great I am, that he is the Alpha, that he is the Omega, that Jesus is God incarnated right in front of them in the flesh. And it's in these times, and it's in these trials, it's in the middle of the storm that Jesus reminds us that we need to have faith in him. In him. Faith that he is there walking towards us, right by our side in the middle of the storm, and that's the simple message of today. Isaiah 41:10 says this, it says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." It's simple, but I think that it needs to be said. We seem to be really good at forgetting the simple fact. We seem to be really good at forgetting the simple fact that Jesus says that where there is trouble, where there is a storm, I am. Literally, all things that we fear, all the things that we fear, all the things that we fight, all the things that exhaust us as human beings, they're all under the authority of Jesus Christ. They're all under his control. The raging waves in our lives, the raging wind, literally are underneath the feet of Jesus. They're literally at the feet of Jesus as he comes walking towards us. Lastly, and this is where we're going to finish up today, we have Peter's response, verse 28. Peter called to him, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter, he went over the side of the boat and he walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and he grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. Why did you doubt me?" And look, we can spend like a whole nother Sunday just on these verses alone, but here's the point. Here's what I want us to take away today. I think that what we see here in the story overall, the story about Peter, I think this very well drives home the point of us keeping our eyes on Jesus, right? And I already said earlier today that I think we, for the most part, if you have heard this story before, I think that we understand that. Our knowledge and our faith, they're found in the person of Jesus. As long as we keep our eyes on Jesus, then the revelation of the knowledge and the faith journey that we have, that's going to keep us above water. That's what keeps us above water. But here's the thing. What we think we know gets in the way. What we think we know. And if we have misplaced faith, what we think we know and misplaced faith can betray us. If we don't base our knowledge and our faith in one person, and one person only, Jesus, what we think we know, and our misplaced faith can absolutely betray us. And that's kind of what happened to Peter, honestly. Like Peter's knowledge, his knowledge of the wind and the waves, his own understanding, Peter's own understanding of what the waters can do to a person, betrayed him. Because Peter knew that the wind could knock him over. Peter probably knew this from experience, that the wind could knock him over and that the waves can drown him. And when Peter focused on what he knew through his own understanding, he lost focus where he could go if he just had a little bit of faith, and he ended up sinking. And this is what happens to us as well when we focus on what we know in our own circumstances, in the middle of our own storm. What we know, it overpowers what Jesus wants us to see. It overpowers what Jesus wants us to see, and we sink. And in the moment when Peter saw the winds and the waves, Peter leaned into his own understanding. I mean, here's the question, and it's so easy for us from our perspective now to question Peter. But I mean, did Peter forget that he was walking on water because of Jesus? Like, how did this leave his mind? Like, he can't do this humanly. He was walking on the water because of Jesus. If Peter would have leaned in on Jesus and not on his own understanding of what could happen, not on his own understanding of what the wind and the waves can do to him or have done to him in his past, but leaned on his understanding that Jesus is there with him, that Jesus was the person that was allowing him to walk on water, then he could have made it all the way over to Jesus doing a handstand, for goodness sake. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us that trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit yourself to him, and he will make your path right. So the question for us as we wrap up today is, what are you leaning on? What are you leaning on in the storm that you are currently going through in your life? Whatever that may be, whatever that storm may be, whose knowledge are you leaning on right now? Are you leaning on your own knowledge? Or are you leaning, or are you trusting in the Lord? Is your faith placed in self, or is it placed in the person of Jesus Christ? Like, are you rowing harder and harder and thinking to yourself that if I just conjure up like enough strength, enough of my own energy, enough of my own self-will, enough of my own self-determination that I'm going to make it through this storm? Or do you have faith that not only will Jesus be there as you're sinking, but that he's been watching, that he's been praying, he's been with you the entire time, even though seemingly you thought he was distant from you up there on that hill? Seemingly distant from you. Do you have the knowledge and the faith that Jesus is who he says that he is the I am? Our next step today, no matter where you are in life right now, your next step today, no matter what circumstance or what storm you are going through right now, your next step is to place the storm, the fear, self-will, self-determination, all the stuff that is keeping you from knowing Jesus and having faith in him to get you through this storm, so place it at his feet. That's your next step today. Place it where it belongs. It belongs at the feet of the person who has the authority over our fear, who has the authority over our sorrow, who has the authority over whatever is happening in the storm of your life right now. You place it at the feet of that person who has authority over everything. So I want to pray for us all together, and that's the next step that I want you to take. Make it your own, just own it. Whatever's in your heart right now as I pray before we end in worship here. take that storm and lay it at the feet of Jesus because he can walk over it. Father,